Hi, everyone. This is Karia Young Eagle from Women's Funding Network. I see that there are still a bunch of folks joining us, so I want to give them a moment or two to make sure that their computer audio or whatever they're signing in from is working properly. All right, so looks like we have a good crew to start with. So I'm really happy that so many of you are able to join us today. It looks like we have quite a global representation from women's funds this morning or afternoon if you're on the East Coast. We've got representation from New York, Vermont, the Women's Funding Alliance in Seattle, Women's Fund of Greater Birmingham, and even the African Women's Development Fund in Ghana. So it's a good representation, and I hope that means a strong, robust conversation and discussion towards the end. But just to start us off, Women's Funding Network has partnered with the Urban Institute to bring you Bridging the Gap, which is all about bridging the gap between childcare and education for low-income parents. And we're going to hear from Gina Adams and Shane Spalding of the Institute, of the Urban Institute. And I know some of you attended our summit in New York City this past July, and you may remember watching a panel called Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, in which Kilolo Kijakazi from the Urban Institute spoke. So you should be sort of familiar with our partnership there and just the way, the great research that comes from the Urban Institute. And if you're not familiar with them, they conduct economic and social policy research so that they can provide and offer solutions and help shape decisions through the power of evidence. So in just a moment, I'll hand the mic over to Shane and Gina so that they can provide the overview of the project. But before I do that, I just need to cover a few important pieces of information to keep in mind while the webinar takes place. So first things first, questions. I really strongly encourage you to ask them. We encourage you to submit any questions that you have that pop up in your mind throughout this virtual presentation in the question box. It's located in your control panel, which you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. You can ask those questions by typing it into the box. It'll show up. I will gather those questions and we can talk about them at the end when we have the question and answer discussion session. If you want to hold off and ask your question verbally during that section of the webinar, go ahead and wait until that happens. Click the little hand icon in the control panel, and that will alert me that you have a question. I'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask your question to the group. My colleague, Candace Elder, she'll be live tweeting today. So if you're part of the Twitter community, you want to join in the conversation, please follow us at Women's Funding and Urban Institute at their handle at Urban Institute. You can see on the slide here that we have that listed. If you go ahead and follow us now, the conversation will be really easy to be a part of and follow throughout the session. So with that, please let me know if you have any questions now. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to the Urban Institute.
So should I go ahead and start, Karia? This is Gina Adams. Can you all hear me? I just want to make sure I'm... Okay, I'm good. So thank you all for joining us today. And I just want to start by thanking the Women's Funding Network for hosting this webinar. We're both Shane and I are very, very pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you about this project. As we said, it focuses on what needs to be done to better meet the needs, childcare needs of low-income parents in education and training. And I think it's a particularly exciting opportunity to talk with all of you, given the really critical role that women's foundations are playing to support economic security and mobility for women and communities across the country. Shane and I are partners in this project. We'll both be presenting today. I'm going to start and then she's going to come in the middle, and then I'll come back for the end. This first slide basically is going to be absolutely review for all of you, but I just want to, so we're all on the same page. I mean, the reason why this matters is that you all know that education and training is absolutely central to the economic security and mobility for low-income women and their families. Child care, as we all know, is a major barrier for not only enrollment, but also for completion. So for the success of education and training, child care is a major issue. And we know that child care, quality early care and education is absolutely essential for children's healthy development and long-term success. So this is why child care is such a key component of two-generation strategies. It is an absolutely critical piece of the goals that many of you have to support economic success and mobility. Despite the importance of these issues, though, they've not really gotten the attention they deserve. The two-gen movement has done a fabulous job of getting these things on many people's radar, but I think all of us would agree that all of us need to be working to elevate these issues even more. So it's why Shane and I have been doing this work at Urban for a few years, and why we're very eager to work with all of you who are active on these issues at the local level. Next slide, please, Shane. So what I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to do a little bit of background on the project, and then we'll go through some of our key findings, and then we'll take some time at the end to really talk about kind of remaining gaps and opportunities, both for action and potentially for collaboration between Urban and you. The last several slides, just so you'll know, have links to all of our project resources and our contact information. So there's several slides there that are just a way of letting you know kind of what's available on our website and what you can access. So let's talk about the project briefly. This is a project that we've been doing for about 2 or 3 years that is supported by the Ford Foundation and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. As we mentioned, the goal is really to figure out how we can elevate and address the child care needs of low-income parents needing education and training. We've put together a cross-disciplinary team for this. What we have discovered is that each of the quote-unquote systems, the child care quote system and the workforce development post-secondary system, are complicated and very rich and have their own language and their own way of approaching things. And so the only way we've been able to really come up with a true way of thinking about bridging this gap is to have a team that reflects both sides. So Shane is a national expert around workforce development and post-secondary education. I'm expert in child care and early education, and together we have kind of embarked on this effort, and it's been a remarkable learning experience. Even after 2 or 3 years, I'm still finding things that I didn't understand about the workforce side. So, and I think Shane would say the same for the child care side. I want to take just 1 minute to just talk about definitions, because one of the first things we learned in doing this work is that there's no common definitions, sometimes even within our fields, much less across them. So, Shane, I'm actually still on the previous slide. So what we're talking about when we talk education and training, sometimes we use the words workforce development, post-secondary education, and by this we really mean the full range of organizations and institutions that support education and training. So it includes higher ed, community colleges, public workforce programs and services, local workforce development organizations, organizations that are supporting parents in education and training, and philanthropic initiatives. So, and we're really focusing on efforts that help low-income adults and in particular parents move ahead. So it's not focusing on the early childhood workforce, though certainly they could benefit from these kinds of linkages. It's really talking about low-income parents. And when we use the term child care in this setting, we're talking about the full range of child care, early education, out-of-school time for school-age children, infant toddler programs, the full range of programs in that domain as well. Okay. So what have we done in this project? Basically, we approached this so far by doing a lot of very broad-reaching, kind of trying to set the stage. We've talked to people at every level, from national policy, national organizations, state policy organizations, and local practitioners to try to get a sense of what's going on, what are the gaps, what are the issues. We've done some analysis of national survey data. What we've done with that work to this point is produced a lot of publications, which are listed at the back, but some of the kind of big chunks of them are a piece that we call, that's the name of the project on, is called Bridging the Gap, which is really an overview of each of the two systems and how they work or don't work for families. So if you're somebody who feels like you understand one of these worlds but don't really understand the other one, that's a really good background piece. There's an executive summary short one, and then there's a much longer one. but it really kind of lays out what's working and not working about how these two worlds fit together or don't fit together for families. We have some papers on kind of the need, which looks at mostly analysis of national survey data, looking at low-income families and their participation in education and training. We've done some overviews of some of the key policy systems, the Child Care and Development Fund, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and TANF. And we've done work looking at actually some of what's going on in local programs and how they're addressing some of these issues. Another area that we've been very focused on is really trying to support a dialogue. One of the things that we heard very loud and clear from our interviews was that there are a lot of people doing interesting work, but they don't know who to talk to on the other side. They aren't connected with each other. There's been, again, serious progress made in a lot of these areas in recent years with the whole 2Gen efforts led by Ascend and others. So there's real movement in this area, but there's kind of additional efforts that can support that work as well. Okay, so the next, I'm going to turn this over to Shane now, and I will come back shortly and fill in the end.
Great. Thank you, Gina. And thanks to Korea and to the Women's Funding Network for having us here today. I've included here, as Gina said, you all are probably familiar with sort of or you understand what the need is here, but we want to share with you some of the data that illustrates the need. Of course, there's no national estimate of the need to address this issue. So in our work, as Gina described, our initial step with this project was really to analyze existing data and literature to understand the issues. We looked at the survey of income and program participation and WIOA data and data from ACF to try to really understand this population, the level of need, the issues. So as you can see here, we're talking about a population that has a need for education, a group with generally low education levels and low skills. So in our analysis, we found that of the 21 million low-income parents, ages 18 to 50, with a child under 12, 58% have a high school credential or less, so they're in need of education. And then if you look more generally in the population, you'll see, there are low levels of education. 1 in 6 U.S. adults has basic or lower levels of literacy, and almost a third possess basic or lower levels of numeracy. We know from looking at labor market data the value of education, right? So the more education that you have, the more likely you are to be employed and the higher your earnings, which of course benefits the parents, but their children as well. When we looked at who was going to school, we saw that about 1 in 10 parents, low-income parents, are enrolled in education and training. About half of these parents also work, and they're likely to have childcare needs, and this is evidenced by some of these data. So 60% are single parents, 69% have a child younger than 6, and 42% have a child younger than 3. I think one of the most amazing things we found, not amazing in a positive way, but just startling, is of those low-income parents who work full-time, half are also attending school full-time. So I think this really tells you a lot about the kinds of strategies that are needed to support this population, the kinds of childcare needs they have, specific needs for younger children, the fact that they are going to need care for both the time that they're at work, both the time they're at work and the time that they're in school. Generally, parents are underrepresented in education and training programs. It speaks to potentially there's a need to give them better access. So if you look at the total population of 50 million parents aged 18 to 50 who have children under 12, about 10 million are low income, but only about 1 in 10 low-income parents are enrolled in education or training. And then those who are not enrolled in education and training or working tend to have lower levels of education. So these are just some of the facts that come from our research on looking at the need. We've also tried to examine sort of what are the system-level challenges, and as Gina said, is working together, coming from our different positions, points of expertise has been really valuable. So we have tried to examine the systems to identify what are the goals of these systems, how do they support the child care needs of parents in education and training, and how these systems intersect. What we have found is that the systems have shared goals and they serve overlapping populations, but they also face a lot of common challenges. Funding is one of the biggest challenges. Both systems can't serve all of the individuals who need services, and that constraint is core to many of the other issues faced. So this, the second point here is related to the funding inadequacies. Because of the funding challenges, this population is not the top priority for either system. For child care subsidies, the priority is often given to parents who are employed, though states differ on this front. And early education programs don't usually prioritize families based on the adult activities. For workforce development and post-secondary education, child care is expensive and parents can face challenges in completing activities. And in the workforce system, there are metrics around employment. So if people are unable to complete, there might be a barrier to being enrolled in these programs, making them a lower priority. The third point on this slide is that these systems are complex. In fact, sometimes when we describe them, we kind of put them in air quotes, right? They're not really systems at all. We have the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, but there are a variety of other workforce funding streams that are at play here, including Pell Grants, post-secondary education, TANF, and a myriad of other programs operating on the workforce side. It's also complex on the child care side. So you have child care development fund subsidies, Head Start, early child care. So this is a very complex landscape. And I think that we sort of add to the complexity with the fact that decisions are made at the state and local levels, meaning that these, quote, systems look very different everywhere you go. The fourth point here is that the child care and workforce systems operate separately. So I think this makes it hard to support parents at this intersection of workforce development and child care, and that there are barriers to serving these families in the policies and the way they're implemented and the various constraints and in both systems. This sort of overarching examination was where we started, and then we, as Gina said, wanted to focus on some of the challenges and opportunities within the systems, looking specifically at the Child Care Development Fund and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, because both were recently reauthorized and present some new opportunities and perhaps some new challenges as well for addressing the child care needs of parents. So I'm first going to talk about CCDF and WIOA, and then I'll talk a little bit about TANF as well. So as part of our examination of CCDF, we did a review of the state child care subsidy eligibility policies I just advanced the slide for you all. We did a review of the state child care subsidy eligibility policies for parents around education and training, and looked at the extent to which parents seeking education and training were even eligible. Well, we found that in most states they were eligible, at least in theory. There was wide variation under what circumstances, and the policies were all over the map with very little coherence. Some states had very broad eligibility rules, but others were highly limited. Some required parents to work while they were in education and training, while others only allowed parents to participate in education and training if they went to school full time, suggesting they weren't really, the policies aren't really always needs of parents. We also actually found enormous variation in the extent to which states reported they were serving the families who needed subsidies for education and training, and it highlighted really the need for better data collection on this issue. As a second phase of this work, we examined, as I said, the relevant opportunities under the reauthorized CCDF. And I think there are some interesting opportunities here to address the child care needs of parents seeking education and training. The CCDF has a focus on family-friendly policies, and I think this provides the opportunity to design programs that can better meet the needs of this specific population. There's also an emphasis on the continuity of care. The law mandates a 12-month eligibility for child care subsidies, and you can imagine this could help with parents who are in education and training who may have breaks in semesters or be in shorter-term programs. And so with that sort of continuity of care, they don't have to worry about the interruption in their eligibility. In the CCDF, there's a focus on cross-system linkages, and again, this is a chance for the child care system and the workforce system and the post-secondary education system to come together, so that the new law provides more of that opportunity. In the CCDF, the newly reauthorized CCDF, there's a focus on consumer education. And I think if you look in the workforce system, just under-resourced, there are opportunities to provide consumer education to individuals, parents who are accessing the workforce system to provide them information about their child care options. So again, an opportunity for partnership. Finally, there's a focus on strengthening the supply of child care to meet the needs of special populations. So this could include providing care during non-traditional hours, or providing particular types of care, and this could be important for meeting the needs of parents in education and training. As we speak, states are wrestling with revamping their CCDF programs, which I think that means there's an opportunity right now to elevate the needs of this population. So we did a similar analysis of the opportunities and challenges under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was also recently reauthorized. And I think under WIOA, one of the largest opportunities is the fact that WIOA focuses more squarely on individuals with barriers to employment, including single parents and young parents. There's also a specific focus in the law on the implementation of career pathway models as a key strategy. So these are models where individuals are supported along a career pathway, provided with skills and support, including childcare. So that I think that leaves an opening for serving people who have education or skill gaps and the need for advancement, and then the opportunity to provide them with the necessary supports. WIOA emphasizes the development of individualized assessment and career planning, and I think that's a place where you could insert assessment of child care needs to the extent that one-stop centers make this a focus. Child care could be a part of the assessment process. The fourth point on this slide is that there's a governor's set-aside that allows for the development of special initiatives. And so for states that have decided to make this population a priority, you can imagine that there could be a special initiative focused on meeting the employment and training needs of low-income parents, and that child care could be a focus of that initiative. And then finally, under WIOA, and it was true under WIA as well, but partnership is really at the crux of the law. It really encourages partnership. There are new partners that are mandatory partners under WIOA. Childcare isn't one of them, but certainly there's a strong focus on partnership, so an opportunity to bridge those connections with childcare agencies. So there are challenges that remain for both the CCDF and WIOA, and they're similar. States are overwhelmed with the demands of these two new pieces of legislation, so it might be difficult for them to focus on the particular needs of this population. Both systems are still underfunded and face competing priorities, and there are still disincentives in place for serving this population. On the workforce side, there are still pretty strong metrics around employment outcomes. And so the barriers that come with having children, having child care needs could still be a barrier to access. On the child care side, the 12-month eligibility requirements may mean providing care to fewer people, and parents needing education and training may not be a priority in this new system. I think there are also continued challenges with the inadequacy of child care market to meet the needs of these families. So we looked at WIOA, and we looked at CCDF, and we also did an examination of TANF. TANF has not been reauthorized. It's been up for reauthorization for some time, and so there could be some opportunities there. We sort of looked at how the alignment between TANF and CCDF and WIOA, as well as what the changes meant for TANF families. Of course, TANF families have a particular need for high-quality workforce development and child care assistance. There's evidence that those receiving TANF have lower levels of education, more barriers, and therefore they're in need of more intensive services. And the current rules and realities create challenges for TANF families to access workforce development and child care. For example, the rules around work requirements and eligible work activities prevent TANF families from accessing training through the workforce system. And the sort of overstressed and underfunded workforce system has often not wanted to serve these high-need families. That's, of course, not true everywhere, but I would say generally that's true. There's difficulty in finding quality child care that meets the needs of TANF families. For example, care during non-standard hours or for short spells of time. That's been very difficult. But I also think there are opportunities under WIOA and CCDF. So again, the focus on individuals with barriers to employment under WIOA and the focus on family-friendly policies and continuity of care, I think provide opportunities to better serve TANF families. The risks, of course, continue, the resource constraints, and the fact that these are high-need populations, but I think there are opportunities as well. There's more work to be done to understand those that are served in each of these systems, to understand implementation of the reauthorized CCDF and WIOA. And then I think there's also lots more work to do to understand how to serve the post-secondary education system and Pell Grants and how low-income parents with child care needs are served in higher education. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gina, who's going to talk about these other opportunities for research, but first is going to discuss some of the challenges faced by parents and some strategies, possible strategies for meeting their needs.
Okay, thanks, Shane. So one of the things that just came through consistently from everybody we talked to is how these issues play out for parents. And you know, many of the challenges parents in this situation face are the challenges that many parents face, but they're kind of the perfect storm of kind of even more complicated. So there's four issues that kind of emerge as being kind of dominant. One is the complexity of ranging for childcare, for education and training activities in terms of the timing and the scheduling, and in particular the fact that, you know, many families had to couple that with work. So this created issues around changing hours or kind of odd hours one day and a different day or non-traditional schedules. So there's that set of issues. Of course, these families are not unique in that, but they face a kind of extra complexity. There's also was a consistent message that families really faced challenges around having very limited information about their child care options. If they were kind of new to the work world, whatever, they may not have had child care at all and were struggling to figure out what they should be using. If they were already working, had child care for some of their needs, but added a new set of needs, then they needed help understanding how that worked. Often there was questions about how do you think about this over the long term, because if you're thinking about career pathway, you may be moving from one kind of activity to another. So it can be very complicated for families to understand what their options are and how to find what they need. Obviously, a huge issue is financial constraints and just limited access to subsidies or low-cost free options. I think you all are all familiar with that problem. And then there's the constant challenge of there's just a limited supply of good quality care, and it's particularly challenging for some populations, in particular infants and toddlers. If you remember back to Shane's earlier point about how many low-income parents have very young children. Children with disabilities is a big category that's underserved and care in rural areas, et cetera. So these are challenges that were consistently identified and are ones that local programs who are working with families need to try to address. So a paper that we just released actually last week involved us interviews that we had done with 17, well, we did interviews with a lot of different programs about how they dealt with these issues and what they faced. And then what we did is we looked across these programs and came up with, we realized that the kinds of activities that programs and initiatives that were working with families did could kind of fall into 6 different steps. Not all programs did all of them. Some did many, some packaged them in very different ways, but they kind of fell into these kind of buckets. We released a paper last week, which I think we may have already sent the link to you all. If not, we'll send it after. It includes, there's a short version that just has a very kind of executive summary level, but then there's a deeper, longer version that has more information on each of these, but also has profiles of 17 programs and initiatives across the country that are doing these things, including some that I believe are in some of the localities that some of you all work in. So, so let me just go quickly through them. The first step is to really think carefully about your needs and your partnerships. So one of the things that really is very evident is that this is because of the complexity of what we're talking about, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. So both because the needs of the families may differ, the kinds of activities they're engaged in may differ, the resources in the community may differ. So, you know, the kind of strategy you would set in place, for example, to support families who are going to do a weekly evening GED class for, certain period of time would be very different than you might design for full-time students who are going to be engaged in an activity. Might be different than a kind of thing you would design for people who are in coupling work and childcare, and education and training. So really understanding the needs of the families you're working with and the structure of the program and the resources in the community, and then thinking through what kinds of partnerships you can put in place, who's out there that can meet some of those needs, identifying shared goals, communication, and developing that kind of collaboration. So that was one step. In addition to this paper, we have actually another paper that focuses specifically on 4 partnerships that goes a little bit more in depth into some of the partnership kinds of ideas. The second step is really thinking about how the education and training services are designed themselves to make it easier for families to access childcare. This can be things like the timing, thinking about things like block scheduling, having regular schedules, having schedules potentially during traditional hours when it's easier to find childcare, those kinds of things. Another issue is that idea was thinking about cohorts of students, because sometimes that can allow them to work together to kind of design a program to support a group of children and a group of families, or help them do cooperative efforts to support each other. And it's also really thinking very strategically about where you would locate the childcare and the workforce services in relation to each other. Sometimes on-site is really great. It particularly works if you have a set of people who are going to be engaged in a particular activity over a long period of time, so that they're going to make a commitment to a particular program for those children. They can have continuity of care. But in other situations or for other families, it's kind of allowing them to access programs that are in their community or whatever might be a better strategy. So it really depends on the local realities and project and program kind of design. The third step is making childcare needs a very strong part of the initial intake and assessment to really help make childcare part of intake and screening. How are we going to pay for it? What kind of needs are they going to have? How does that reflect? How does it work with the workforce efforts in terms of the trajectory that the family is going to be on, and really continuing to work with families over time. I think you all know that childcare can, your needs can change. If your schedule changes, your needs can change, or your child gets older and you want a different kind of arrangement. So it's not like it's something that can just be fixed at the beginning, but needs kind of ongoing support and revision and communication with families. The fourth step is to help families really understand and find childcare options in their communities. And in this situation, the best option, obviously, is if there's a resource and referral agency in your community, because they really understand the complexity and can really help people think through the kinds of things they might need, how to help them find it, what kinds of resources might be there to help them access and pay for care, et cetera. Again, this is something that needs kind of ongoing engagement, not just a one-time, because these needs can change. The fifth step is helping families access subsidies. Shane talked a little bit about this already. One of the things that we are quite concerned about right now is that there does seem to be some initial lower prioritizing of this population. After we released this report last week, we got a very sad email from one of our providers saying that their state had just made frozen intakes for any families in education and training because of the increased requirements under reauthorization without having any additional funding. So I think this is a bit of an uphill battle in some places, but there are, in many places, families still can get subsidies, and the subsidy, I think, is a very important cornerstone for families. The kinds of things that programs can do in this area is to help screen families, help them navigate the subsidy eligibility process, help them think through kind of what kind of paperwork they're going to need, how to define things. They also can actually advocate for policy changes in the state or the locality about how to make these services more accessible for these families. And they can try to think creatively about subsidies for other sources. For example, there are a few places, and we hope we're going to find more, where local assessment boards are using WIOA funds to help pay for childcare, or the SNAP ENT program, or local funding. So thinking about how to help families pay for care. And then the final step is really around facilitating access to a supply of affordable care, which includes building on things like Head Start or pre-K, identifying other kinds of local resources, exploring cooperative kinds of strategies, and particular issues around trying to address the challenges of non-traditional hour care, which can be a big challenge. So where are we now? So there's obviously a lot of challenges, but the exciting thing for us in doing this most recent report is that there are really smart programs doing really interesting work and figuring out workarounds. It'd be nice to make it easier for them, but they're doing it anyway. And again, it has to be kind of very tailored to the local realities. But the kinds of needs that are really facing us, and I think the things we have to be working on are, to continue to work on addressing funding gaps and trying to identify new resources, thinking very strategically about building public and political will for these families. It's been very interesting to me that childcare for student parents has kind of come back onto the radar, and thanks, no doubt, to efforts of people like you all. So you're hearing that conversation as being kind of part of the political conversation right now. We would need to do a much better job, I think, of documenting and understanding the need. Kind of what are the experiences of families and practitioners? What kinds of assets and gaps do we see? We also excuse me, need to do a much better job of kind of the next level down of really thinking about policy barriers, not just on the policy side, but also in how they're implemented, because what you find often is that individual programs are learning some of these issues, but there's not a lot of opportunities for them to share what they've learned with each other and kind of learn from each other's mistakes. We need to be thinking we have a sense that there's more going on in a number of areas that we think is very important to explore in terms of policy issues. We really need to be doing a better job of documenting what is working and how it's working. If we're asking people to devote scarce resources to this kind of activity, to provide some kind of evidence of what kind of impact it's likely to have and what kind of payoff it's likely to have is critical. There's basically almost no evaluations or assessments of kind of how these things actually work on the ground and what kind of impact they're having on families. Obviously, doing more of it to help more programs actually put these kinds of pieces into place is important. And then really important to continue to kind of support the dialogue and partnerships and communication, because again, our sense from the work we've done is that there's a lot of knowledge out there. There's just not a lot of mechanisms for people to share it. So where we would love to talk to you all about, in addition to the findings, is we are in a place where we are trying to kind of figure out how to take this to the next level ourselves. one opportunity is that we are interested in identifying potential partners who might be interested in focusing on this issue at the local level or the state level, either by starting new programs or by working to integrate these kinds of things with a more intentional focus on this connection into kind of existing efforts. We have some access to some small amount of funds from the Casey Foundation that can allow us to do some initial work with some communities around TA and planning and thinking through some of these issues. And if there's a possibility for additional resources to do longer term work in these communities, then we might be able to use some of those Casey funds to do some deeper work in selected sites to kind of lay the groundwork for doing some more in-depth work and potentially some evaluation and implementation, assessment, lessons learned kind of sharing. So we're really looking for partners that we can work with at the community level to kind of fill some of the gaps that we just mentioned, gathering information on the need, assessing promising strategies, gathering information that can inform other communities that are interested in doing this kind of work. So that's one of the many things we'd love to talk with you all about now in the question and answer. So we threw up a few of our questions to just in case it's useful, and we'd love to take your questions and have a conversation now. So why don't we start throwing some out? Karia, I don't know kind of how the process is, but I guess the first question that we'd love to get your thoughts about are kind of, as you've heard what we've said and think and reflect on your own experiences in the widely diverse set of communities that you all work in, what kinds of reflections do you have about what we've talked about, or kind of what questions do you have about how this is, as you think about how this plays out in your communities? I mean, one of the things that was interesting as we looked at how these things played out is that often it seemed like there was an individual or somebody who kind of got it from working with families and then managed to put together the pieces or the individuals or the leadership. But it happens at all sorts of different levels. I mean, in our report, for example, we have everything from state models in Arkansas, their kind of partnerships between career pathways and the child care agency at the state level, all the way down to local programs that are figuring out ways of, working to intensively support families or to provide connections. So there's so many different ways that one can attack these issues and approach them. In some ways, Shane and I have sometimes said that the complexity of the problem in some ways also means that there's a lot of opportunities for different ways that you can tackle the issues and try to move them forward. So. Does this resonate with anybody? Have you all faced these kinds of issues in your community?
Gina, I'm just getting a comment that there's some trouble hearing you. Could you ask that question again?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm glad somebody spoke up. Is that better? I'm getting closer to the phone. I was just saying that I'm wondering whether what we found, whether there's elements of these challenges in your communities that you all see or that you are finding particularly complicated. I mean, one of the things I'm assuming some of you might be dealing with is this kind of the changing of the child care system and some of the potential additional limits that are being placed on supports that might be able to help these families. But I don't know, I'd be curious if anybody's seeing that, or if you're seeing any of the positive changes from the reauthorization of both WIOA and child care.
Gina, this is Karia, and I just got a question in from someone in Vermont. Her name's Shannon, and she says that her question is, what are some strategies around providing non-traditional hours for childcare? It's a huge issue in Vermont, especially with the seasonal work and the shift work. that a lot of people are employed with, and it's hard to provide childcare around?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I would say it is one of the biggest challenges that we face. I think one of the struggles that I've honestly had is that when you're talking about non-traditional hour care, I think the child care and early education field has done a phenomenal job of really trying to help people understand the importance of high quality, well-trained teachers, really thinking about what children need. The challenge is that I think that they may also need to have care during evenings and weekends that don't necessarily have to meet that same level of very high quality. The focus on quality has understandably really led to a focus on child care centers, which are a fabulous way to support children, and I think every kid needs to have access to that. But it doesn't mean they may not also need to have access to care that can be in their own home in the evenings. Pretty much no parent I know, for example, wants a child care center for their child if they have overnight work or evening or weekend work. I'm exaggerating. I'm sure there are some parents who would like that, but a lot of parents really want their child at home. So thinking creatively about how do we ensure the safety and well-being and love for kids, but not necessarily having the same kind of expectations of high quality early education. So bringing the kind of the safe, good, loving child care conversation back into the area is important. That said, some of the people try, this is not by any means, I'm not trying to say this is a complete answer, but one thing I think is to start really highlighting those issues so that we can get that back into the conversation. There can be things like one of the sites we talked to, though it didn't work in the long term, it worked in the short term, they had a particular evening kind of activity. There was a Y nearby that had was very close to where they were offering their activity, that had a facility, and they got the Y to stay open one night a week to do that kind of, targeted. Families had to be in this particular place on Tuesday nights from 6 to 9, and that was a place that kids could be brought to. Another one was interesting, was one of the sites had developed a list of approved, basically approved babysitters, people who they had vetted to know that they knew CPR and first aid and had certain kinds of basic training. And that list of approved providers they would pay for they would pay for the cost of that care for homework or evening and weekend classes. Another site really thought about using a cohort model to think about cooperative kinds of arrangements so that families could trade with each other. That can be really complicated, but in certain settings that can really work. So those are a few ideas, but I agree with you. I feel like this is one of the big places where we have to focus much more intentionally, but I do think part of it is getting a little more comfortable with the idea that this is not necessarily center-based. This is not necessarily going to be the highly trained, BA, MA kind of teachers. This is in some ways what many of us use when we needed childcare, a babysitting arrangement for an evening activity, and kind of figuring out how do we bring that back into the conversation while keeping our kids safe and loved and well cared for.
Thank you, Gina. I realized that the webinar was glitchy for a moment, and wanted to make sure everyone who's on the call knows about your interest in identifying potential partners, either at the local or state levels, basically working with folks at the community level to dig a little deeper into all of this. And someone's curious about how that might work, what the next steps are, who to contact, all of that type of information.
Sure. Do you want me to repeat what I said during that part of it, or was it glitchy when I was talking about that do I need to repeat it, or do I just going to go from?
I'm not sure when it started to, I would just go over the basics. Be great to share maybe the email addresses, your email addresses, and what the next steps might be.
Sure. So basically, we have been given a small amount of resources from the foundation to work with some sites. The goal is to really find some sites in the long term that we can raise additional funds to think about really doing kind of a good assessment of what's working, how it's working, lessons can we learn in a few sites that are doing this to share with others. What can we, how can we start filling some of those gaps? So the Casey Foundation has supported us to do some identify partners that might be interested in this kind of activity, and what we are able to do is provide some technical assistance and kind of basic supports around planning. we'd be happy, for example, to do this kind of webinar for some of your grantees if you have folks in your communities that would be interested in doing this kind of thinking, learning more about this. And then if that seems like something that would be interesting, you should certainly just reach out to me. I'm at gadams, G-A-D-A-M-S, @urban.org, or Shane is S. Spalding, S-S-P-A-U-L-D-I-N-G, @urban.org. And just let us know that you're interested in talking, and we'd love to follow up. Our real goal is to find, to really help this kind of information be more available to those of you who are working in communities and supporting efforts in communities, and to try to figure out ways of spreading that, and hopefully to be able to identify some deeper work that we can do with select communities to start filling some of these holes.
I want to give folks just another minute or so to ask any looming questions that you might have. I saw some comments come in about childcare being a really high priority in states like Arizona. It's just reinforcing the idea or the issue that adequate and safe childcare options are really lacking in so many communities across the United States. So it sounds like there's a lot for people to connect about, to share ideas about what's working, best practices, so that we can all work towards a better solution together.
That would be great. And at the end of when you get the slides, you'll see at the end we have a list of all of the publications that we have. And I think some of them might provide some, depending on which angle you're interested in, they would have some of the answers to some of this, but Shane and I are both very, very open to having phone calls and talking more about some of these issues and just brainstorming what can be done. We don't have answers for all of it, but we certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about them, so we're happy to share what we've learned.
Great. And any of you who have registered and you're for any of you listening out there, I will send out a follow-up email with all the links to the reports, the resources that they talked about, as well as the recording of this webinar. So I'm happy to invite you to share this with any colleagues or anyone in your network that might be interested in learning more or thinking about partnering. So I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And we're having a couple more webinars this year, one in October that's all about the secret sauce for collaboration. And in November, right before the election, we are having a webinar about ramping up your event revenue. So please stay tuned to womensfundingnetwork.org/events, and your inbox will be sending out all the information you need to register for those upcoming webinars as well. So a huge thanks to Gina and Shane for spending the time today to share all of this information. But yeah, please follow up with you if you have any additional questions.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you all taking the time to talk with us today.
Yes, thank you.